April 9, 1241. Imagine standing on a field southeast of Legnica, Poland, and watching the most advanced military machine in the known world swallow your entire civilization in a single afternoon. The smoke comes first. A thick, black curtain of it, deliberate, engineered, weaponized, rolling across the field and cutting your best warriors off from your infantry. Then the screaming. Then silence. Duke Henry II the Pious, the most powerful Polish ruler of his age, a man who had spent his entire adult life consolidating power, building alliances, and imagining himself as the future king of a united Poland, dies running away. The Mongols catch him, behead him, and parade his head on a spear through the streets. 9 ears are cut from Polish dead and filled into sacks. Not 9 men. 9 sacks full of ears. What happens to a civilization after that? What happens to the mind of a people who watched everything they believed about war, about strength, about God's favor, shatter in an afternoon? That's what this story is actually about. Because 47 years later, in the frozen winter of 1287 to 1288, the Mongols came back. They came with a great host. They expected the same Poland they had shattered at Legnica. What they found instead destroyed them. The impossible is just the difficult that nobody has figured out yet. And Poland spent 47 years figuring it out. Here's what everyone gets wrong about the Mongols, including the Poles who survived them. The Mongols weren't just a military force. They were a psychological weapon. Every campaign they ran was engineered to make the next campaign unnecessary. By the time they arrived at your borders, you already knew what had happened to the Russians, to the Bulgarians, to the Cumans. The Mongols spread their own legend like a virus, and it worked. It worked so well that when the Mongol army appeared near Krakow in 1241, the city's own defenders burned it themselves rather than risk the Mongols taking the buildings and using them as shelter. Think about that. They destroyed their own city. The papal envoy Giovanni de Piene del Carpine, who traveled into Mongol territory just 4 years after Legnica, described their tactics with terrifying clarity. They fight, he wrote, not by pressing close, but by flight and return, by cunning more than force. The feigned retreat. The smokescreen. The encirclement. These weren't just tactics. They were psychological weapons designed to make European heavy cavalry, train their whole lives to charge forward, to seek glory in direct combat, destroy themselves by doing exactly what they were trained to do. At Legnica, Henry's knights saw what looked like a Mongol unit beginning to rout. They did what knights do. They charged. They chased. They broke formation. The Mongols closed the trap. The medieval chronicler Jan de Lugas, writing over 2 centuries later, recorded that the Mongols reportedly shouted the word, "Flee," in Polish through the smokescreen, psychologically exploiting the chaos they had manufactured, seeding panic into the Polish line from within. Duke Henry II had done nearly everything right beforehand. He had united fractured Polish duchies. He had gathered Teutonic knights, Templars, and Hospitallers. He was waiting for his brother-in-law, King Wenceslas of Bohemia, who was just 1 day's march away with 50,000 more men. Henry's fatal flaw wasn't tactical incompetence. It was something far more universal and far more human. It was overconfidence born from the wrong kind of experience. Henry had never faced an enemy like this. Nobody in Europe had. His mental model of war, built entirely on cavalry charges, on chivalric direct combat, on the rules and rhythms of feudal warfare, was perfectly calibrated for the enemies he had always fought. It was catastrophically wrong for the enemy in front of him. As one military historian observed on the History Forum thread discussing the battle, These weren't professional soldiers making rational decisions. They were professional fighters whose entire psychological identity was built around the glory of the direct charge. To wait, to hold, to refuse combat. That was psychologically unbearable for men whose self-worth was fused with bold action. The Mongols knew this. They planned for it. Henry II rode into the trap. The flower of Polish knighthood died with him. And King Wenceslas, upon hearing the news, turned around and went home. For the next generation of Polish rulers, this was the psychological wreckage they inherited. To understand what 1241 destroyed, you first have to understand what it was destroying. Henry II hadn't built his power through luck. He had spent years uniting the fractured Piast duchies, negotiating with the Holy Roman Empire for the recognition of a Polish crown, building the most credible claim to Polish kingship since the monarchy had collapsed into feudal fragments. His father, Henry the Bearded, had laid the groundwork. Henry II was weeks, maybe months, away from being crowned King of Poland. The confidence wasn't delusional. It was earned. But earned confidence carries a hidden trap. It anchors your identity to a specific worldview. Henry II's worldview said that strength comes from massed cavalry, from allied numbers, from coordinated charges. That worldview had served every European ruler for 3 centuries. It was the universal mental model of medieval warfare. What Henry's confidence blinded him to was the possibility that the rules themselves could be different. That an enemy could operate on entirely different psychological and tactical assumptions, and render all his accumulated expertise worthless. Psychologist Ronnie Janoff-Bullman, in her landmark 1992 theory of shattered assumptions, described exactly this mechanism. We all operate under what she called cognitive schemas, mental models of how the world works, how safe it is, what success looks like. When something catastrophically violates those schemas, it doesn't just defeat us tactically. It ruptures our identity. The self is no longer experienced as capable. The world is no longer predictable. That's what Legnica did to Poland. It didn't just kill Henry II. It killed the story Poland told itself about itself. And for the next generation, for his heir Bolesław the Chaste, who had fled to Hungary as a 15-year-old boy during the invasion, the question became, what do you do with a shattered story? Here's what makes Poland's story psychologically remarkable. The Mongols didn't give them time to forget. The Mongols came back under Burundi. They ravaged Lesser Poland again, sacked Krakow, burned Sandomierz and Lublin. Bolesław, now the ruling duke, the same boy who had watched the 1241 disaster from a safe distance, fled again. To Hungary. To Sieradz. The pattern repeated. If 1241 was the first crack in Poland's psychological foundation, 1259 to 1260 was the earthquake that revealed just how much damage had been done. Bolesław hadn't changed his approach in 18 years. He still had no answer to the Mongols in the open field. He still ruled wooden cities with wooden castles. He still couldn't stop them. This is the most psychologically dangerous moment in any cycle of defeat. The second failure. The first failure can be rationalized. Bad luck. Wrong day. One more thing they hadn't thought of. Cognitive dissonance. The mind's immune system defends the existing worldview. We almost had them. Next time we'll be ready. The second failure is different. The second failure forces a question that the first failure lets you avoid. What if the problem isn't our execution? What if the problem is our entire approach? For a people whose warrior culture, whose identity, whose Christianity was all tangled up with the idea that courage in direct combat was the supreme virtue, that question was psychologically excruciating. because the answer would require them to stop being who they thought they were. Psychological research from Tedeschi and Calhoun, who coined the term post-traumatic growth in the 1990s, identified exactly this mechanism as the engine of transformation. They argued that catastrophic experiences don't grow people because of the suffering. They grow people because the suffering forces what they called cognitive restructuring, a mandatory rebuilding of the mental schemas that were shattered. The key word is mandatory. You cannot keep the old worldview. It demonstrably doesn't work. So you either fall apart entirely, or you build something new. Poland slowly began to build something new. It started with stone. The most quietly revolutionary decision made by Bolesław the Chaste after 1241 was not a battle. It was a building project. Across the decades that followed the first Mongol invasion, Poland began converting its wooden fortifications, the kind that burned when the Mongols arrived, to stone. The walled city of Krakow received Magdeburg rights in 1257, the framework for structured urban planning and legal autonomy that allowed the city to be rebuilt with deliberate, defensible architecture. The castle on Wawel Hill was reinforced. New fortifications rose across Silesia and Lesser Poland, the Trail of the Eagle's Nests, a chain of stone strongholds along the uplands that would eventually form a 163-kilometer defensive network. This wasn't heroic. Nobody was going to tell stories about the Duke who built walls. But it was adaptive. And adaptation, unlike heroism, is what determines who survives. The lesson being learned, painfully over decades, through humiliation and flight, was simple but psychologically radical. The Mongol strength is the open field. Don't give them the open field. By 1287, when Duke Leszek II the Black received word that the Mongol host under Nogai Khan and Tulabuga was massing on the Polish-Galician border, Poland was a different country than the one that had bled at Legnica. Not different in the ways that make great stories. Different in the ways that actually matter. The Mongol invasion of December 1287 was, by any traditional measure, terrifying. Nogai Khan assembled what the Galician Volhynian Chronicle called a great host. His own cavalry plus Ruthenian vassal troops under multiple dukes. He planned to loot Lesser Poland, teach Leszek the Black a lesson for interfering in Ruthenian and Hungarian affairs, and demonstrate, once again, that Poland was a raiding ground. The Mongols split into two main columns. The northern force advanced toward Sandomierz. The southern group, under Nogai himself, aimed for Krakow, the heart of the Polish realm. The Polish response was not a heroic cavalry charge to meet them in the field. It was almost the exact opposite. Stage 1. Deny them the open field. The Polish strategy, described in sources as ad hoc, because there was no grand prepared plan, only a trained instinct for how to survive, concentrated forces in castles and fortified cities rather than marching out to meet the Mongols. The memory of Legnica, the memory of knights breaking formation and riding into the smokescreen, was encoded into every decision. Leszek positioned his main force in the path of one column, but he did not charge out to destroy it. He stood. He blocked. He used the terrain. Stage 2. Let stone do what flesh cannot. The southern column under Nogai reached Krakow on December 24, 1287, Christmas Eve, a psychologically loaded choice of arrival date, perhaps deliberately designed to maximize symbolic terror and the chaos of a holy day disrupted. What they found was not the wooden Krakow that had burned in 1241. Contemporary sources describe Krakow's castle as being made entirely of stone, protected by catapults and large and small crossbows. The Mongols launched an assault. They suffered heavy casualties. Several of their commanders were killed. Nogai Khan, who had arrived expecting a repetition of 1241, found instead something his cavalry doctrine had no answer for: a city that simply refused to fall. This was the 47-year investment paying its first dividend. Stage 3, the counterpunch. While Nogai was bleeding against Krakow's walls, a Hungarian-Polish expeditionary force under a commander named George moved up from the south through Podolinek and Kezmarok. They added local troops as they marched. On their way, they found a Mongol detachment of 1,000 men that had become isolated, separated from the main body of Nogai's force. They annihilated it, killed the commander, every man. This was the Battle of Stary Saks, the last major engagement of the Third Mongol invasion of Poland, and it was the payback that Legnica had been waiting 47 years to collect. Leszek, now mobilizing his main army and moving to combine it with George's Hungarians, recognized the trap closing on Nogai. Nogai recognized it too. His remaining forces were scattered, outnumbered in detail, and now facing the one thing Mongol doctrine had never anticipated from Poland: coordinated counteroffensive pressure after a failed siege. Nogai regrouped. Nogai retreated. He arrived back in Ruthenia in late January 1288, where, with a certain grim irony, his soldiers plundered the villages of his own Ruthenian vassals to recover what they couldn't take from Poland. Compared to the first two invasions, this raid was short, less devastating. No significant cities fell. No significant castles fell. Poland had not just survived. Poland had, for the first time, denied. The Mongols never launched a full-scale invasion of Poland again. Here is the thing about this story that most people miss. Poland didn't win because they became better at the kind of war that lost at Legnica. They didn't train their knights to be faster. They didn't perfect the cavalry charge. They didn't find a way to see through smokescreen. None of that would have worked. Poland won because they stopped trying to be what they were before the trauma, and built something completely new because of it. Post-traumatic growth theory, developed by psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, distinguishes between two responses to catastrophic defeat. Resilience is returning to who you were before. Bouncing back. Recovering. Most people and most civilizations aim for resilience because it's psychologically comfortable. It validates the old identity. Post-traumatic growth is different. It's what happens when the trauma is so complete, so shattering, that returning to the old self is no longer possible. The schemas are broken. The old worldview is demonstrably wrong. And in that rubble, something new, something stronger, because it's built on honest knowledge of failure, begins to grow. Poland chose, generation by generation, the harder path. They let the defeat at Legnica teach them. They looked at what the Mongols were actually doing, exploiting open fields, exploiting predictable cavalry charges, exploiting wooden cities that burned, and they systematically removed each of those vulnerabilities. Not in a single heroic campaign. In 47 years of patient, unglamorous, psychologically difficult construction. Boleslaw V built walls instead of legends. Leszek II stood in a path instead of charging down one. Anonymous Polish engineers replaced wood with stone while their princes were still telling stories about Duke Henry's heroic last charge. The real heroes of this story never made it into the chronicles. And 47 years after Legnica, when the Mongols arrived expecting the same broken civilization, they found something that had been rebuilt from the foundation up, not despite the shattering, but because of it. The Mongols had taught Poland exactly how to defeat the Mongols. You just have to be willing to learn from the thing that destroyed you. Here is the question this story leaves you with. What has already broken in your life that you've been trying to rebuild into what it was, when the smarter move, the move that actually leads to growth, would be to build something completely different from the rubble? Legnica was the worst day in Polish history. It was also the first day of the strategy that made Poland impossible to conquer. The impossible is just the difficult that nobody has figured out yet. Poland figured it out.